I knew Greg hated me the second he walked into my office that first Monday morning, cheap cologne so thick it could strip paint, teeth bared in that salesman's grin that never touched his eyes. He was the kind of guy who called himself a closer, but couldn't close a jar of pickles without middle management signing off. Still, I didn't care. I'd spent 15 years building the $500 million relationship with Dalton Global, the one account that kept our lights on and half the staff employed. I'd flown through blizzards to make their quarterly reviews, missed anniversaries to fix emergencies at midnight, and memorized every exec's birthday, golf handicap, and preferred whiskey. This account wasn't just on my desk, it was the desk, and I was damn good at keeping it there. The problem was Greg didn't like that. In his mind, my history with Dalton was a threat to his authority. He'd been brought in 6 months ago to modernize our division, which in corporate speak meant cut costs and make a lot of PowerPoints about synergy. He never said it outright, but the way his lip curled when the Dalton CEO, Mr. Dalton himself, greeted me before him, yeah, he hated that, hated me. On paper, things were fine. We were meeting deliverables, smoothing out supply chain hiccups, and even expanding into 2 new regions with Dalton's blessing. In reality, Greg was constantly circling, looking for a way to undermine me. I caught him more than once accidentally excluding me from email threads about the account, then claiming he thought I was looped in. He'd pop into my calls with Dalton execs uninvited, hijack the conversation, and turn it into a pitch for some shiny new process nobody asked for. And every time, I'd have to steer things back on course before we lost their attention or their patience. By late summer, the tension was thick enough to butter. The quarterly review with Dalton was coming up, biggest one of the year, and I'd prepped for weeks. I had the numbers, the slides, the projections, even the risk assessments ready to go. Greg, he'd spent most of his time in strategy meetings that somehow always ended before happy hour. I assumed he'd at least skim my deck before we presented. That was my mistake. The morning of the meeting, he swung by my office with a smirk. Got your slides, Sarah? I'm going to lead the presentation. You can jump in if there's time. No discussion, no courtesy, just that smug declaration as if he'd been grinding on this for months. I should have pushed back, but I also knew Dalton's team. They respected me. If Greg wanted to crash and burn, maybe letting him light the match would finally show him where the real work came from. Walking into Dalton's boardroom that afternoon, I felt the familiar hum of focus settle in. The room was glass-walled, sunlight pouring over polished wood, and the air smelled faintly of the expensive coffee they brewed for these events. Mr. Dalton sat at the head of the table, calm as ever, flanked by his COO and CFO. The rest of the execs gave me nods and warm smiles. Greg clocked it all, his jaw tightening before he launched into the presentation like a game show host on speed. It took exactly 7 minutes for him to start mangling my carefully built numbers. He rounded off projections to make them more optimistic, ignored flagged supply risks, and described our fulfillment rates as perfect despite the fact that we'd been operating at 94%. I tried to interject light corrections, nothing aggressive, but Greg brushed me off mid-sentence. The Dalton execs exchanged glances, polite but cooling. Mr. Dalton's pen tapped once, slow and deliberate. I could feel it, the shift in the room. My credibility was being chipped away, brick by brick, in front of the very people I'd spent a decade proving myself to. Greg either didn't notice or didn't care. He was riding the sound of his own voice, basking in the attention, oblivious to the subtle tightening of expressions around the table. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him before the damage became permanent. But here's the thing, Greg wasn't just undermining me, he was undermining the company's single most important client relationship. And the kind of people who run $500 million accounts don't forget slights like that. They file them away like IOUs, payable in full when the moment's right. That thought, sharp and sudden, made me sit back in my chair. Let him talk, let him keep digging. Because if I was reading Mr. Dalton's eyes correctly, Greg had just made his first withdrawal from an account you do not overdraw without consequences. Greg clicked to the next slide, my slide, and started explaining our Q3 projections like he'd personally run the numbers himself. The problem? He hadn't. He was pulling facts out of thin air, cherry-picking the rosiest possible interpretations, while leaving out the inconvenient truths I'd been careful to prepare Dalton's team for. So with our current trend line, we're on track to exceed delivery expectations by at least 12%, he said with a grin, tapping the graph that clearly showed we were trending at 6% over baseline. I opened my mouth to correct him, but before I could speak, he lifted a hand like a traffic cop. We'll get to questions later. The Dalton COO's eyebrow ticked upward. The CFO scribbled something down without looking up. And Mr. Dalton, he just sat there, silent, tip of his pen moving once across his notepad, as if logging the moment for future use. I focused on my breathing, willing my expression to stay neutral. This wasn't my first rodeo. Clients can smell tension like blood in the water. If I reacted too visibly, it would confirm Greg's narrative that I was defensive or unprepared. But inside, I could feel the heat building in my chest. Every time Greg clarified a data point, He was dismantling months of trust. Then he started implying, ever so smoothly, that the numbers he'd just twisted were evidence of operational inconsistencies that he'd inherited. He didn't say my name, but the subtext was louder than the actual words. I was apparently the messy past he was here to clean up. I caught the COO's eyes on me, waiting to see if I'd take the bait. Instead, I turned my gaze to Mr. Dalton and spoke directly to him, careful and measured. The client concerns we discussed last quarter are on track to resolution. The forecast I prepared accounts for the seasonal dip in supply chain throughput. The year-over-year gains remain consistent. My tone was steady, but my hands stayed folded in my lap to keep from gripping the table. Greg gave a tight chuckle. Sarah's been cautious. I'm bringing a little optimism to the table. The room went still in that subtle way high-level meetings do when the real conversation has nothing to do with the slides on screen. Nobody spoke, but everyone's eyes were moving, measuring, weighing, cataloging the exchange. When the presentation ended, Greg looked smug, as if he'd just saved the account instead of straining it to the breaking point. He thanked everyone, closed the laptop, and stood like he'd just wrapped a keynote at a conference. Then, without warning, he turned to Mr. Dalton's entire executive board and said, "One last note. Sarah's position is being restructured, effective immediately. She won't be your point of contact moving forward." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My ears rang. A slow, sharp burn crept up the back of my neck. He had just fired me, right there in Dalton's own boardroom, like I was some disposable temp instead of the person who'd shepherded this account through recessions, supply crises, and a half-dozen leadership changes. Mr. Dalton didn't react, not visibly. He simply folded his hands on the table and studied me the way a chess player studies the board after an unexpected move. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was something else, something calculating. I gathered my notes, each movement deliberate. "Thank you for your time," I said to the room, my voice calm even as my heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't look at Greg again, didn't give him the satisfaction of a glare or a stammer. Walking out of that glass-walled room felt like crossing a line I hadn't chosen but would damn well finish walking. My career with the company might have ended in that moment, but I had the distinct, unsettling sense that this wasn't the end of my role in Dalton's story. Not by a long shot. Greg's words hung in the air like the stench of burnt coffee, sharp, bitter, and impossible to ignore. Effective immediately wasn't just a termination. It was a public execution, staged in the most high-profile theater our company had. I heard the faint shuffle of papers, the subtle clearing of throats from Dalton's board members, but no one spoke. These were people trained to maintain composure in hostile negotiations and billion-dollar contract disputes. Still, the silence had weight. I could feel Greg watching me, waiting for a crack, anger, tears, anything he could use to confirm his narrative. My hands were steady as I slid my notebook into my bag. Years of dealing with CEOs and procurement sharks had taught me the power of restraint. In these moments, words can be bullets or handshakes, and I wasn't about to fire the wrong one. Mr. Dalton's eyes met mine as I rose from my chair. They were as unreadable as they'd been throughout Greg's little coop, but there was something there, a faint, almost imperceptible glint. Not sympathy, not quite approval either. It was more like recognition. A silent note passed between us, invisible to everyone else. Greg, clearly uncomfortable with the lack of applause for his big move, tried to fill the void. "We'll make the transition as smooth as possible," he said to the table, his voice oozing that fake assurance people use when they've already decided you're irrelevant. "We have new talent coming in who will bring fresh perspective." Fresh perspective. Corporate code for we're replacing a seasoned, proven asset with someone cheaper and easier to control. I resisted the urge to snort. I glanced around the room, deliberately bypassing Greg's face. "Thank you all for the partnership over the years. I wish you continued success." My voice was even, not warm but not icy either, perfectly balanced. If there was one thing Dalton's team knew, it was that I never left loose threads. As I stepped into the hallway, the glass walls still framing Greg's forced smile in the background, the adrenaline started to wear off. Humiliation prickled in my chest, spreading out like static under my skin. 15 years of loyalty, erased with a 2-minute speech. My inbox access would probably be gone before I made it to my car. Downstairs, the security guard, Tom, a retired cop who'd been there longer than me, gave me a puzzled look when I handed him my badge. "They really letting you go?" he asked, his voice low. "Looks that way," I said, forcing a half smile. "Guess I'm free for lunch now." As I walked to my car, I replayed the meeting in my head. Every pause, every glance, and every second of that unbroken eye contact with Mr. Dalton. There had been a flicker there just before I'd stood up like a man filing something away for later. Humiliation was still sharp in my throat, but beneath it was something else. A strange, almost dangerous awareness that this might not be as final as Greg thought. Because I knew two things Greg didn't. Dalton's team trusted me more than they trusted him, and Greg had just bet his reputation on being able to deliver without me. And in our world, bad bets have a way of coming due faster than you expect. By the time evening rolled around, I'd almost convinced myself to stop checking my phone every 5 minutes. Almost, the truth was, didn't know what to do with myself. My whole professional rhythm had been ripped away in a single afternoon, and I was pacing my living room like someone waiting for a jury verdict. I'd ordered Thai takeout I wasn't even hungry for, poured a glass of wine I hadn't touched. My bag sat on the couch, still holding the notebook I'd packed up in front of Greg and the Dalton board. I hadn't opened it since. When my phone finally lit up, I almost didn't answer. A known number. Could have been HR calling to confirm I'd turned in my laptop, or worse, Greg, eager to gloat one more time. But something made me swipe anyway. Sarah, a deep, measured voice said, "It's David Dalton." I sat down hard as if my legs had suddenly remembered gravity. "Mr. Dalton," I said carefully, trying not to sound like my pulse had just tripled. "I wasn't expecting, I'll get right to it," he said, in the same tone I'd heard him use to close eight-figure deals. "I need someone to lead our vendor strategy team, starting immediately." I blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "Immediately? Yes. You know our operations, our expectations, our history. I don't have the luxury of a learning curve right now." I didn't speak for a moment. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a lifeline thrown straight into the wreckage Greg had left me in. And the fact that Dalton himself was making the call? That was a message. He continued, "Your first priority will be a comprehensive review of all major supplier contracts for compliance. That includes," he paused just long enough for the wait to settle, "your former employer." The air in my apartment seemed to shift, like the world had just tilted slightly in my favor. "I see," I said, my voice even, though inside something sharp and electric was beginning to hum. "Want an honest report," Dalton said. "No diplomacy, no sugarcoating. If there are breaches, we address them. If they failed to meet terms, we end it." "I understand," I said, and I did. This wasn't just an audit, it was a loaded weapon, and he was handing it to me without so much as a safety catch. Dalton's voice softened by a hair. "I watched what happened today. I don't take kindly to theatrics in my boardroom. I trust you'll handle this cleanly." "Of course," I said. When we hung up, I stared at the darkened screen for a long moment, the Thai food cooling untouched beside me. The humiliation from earlier was still there, but it had shifted, distilled into something precise. Purposeful. Greg thought he'd ended my career. In reality, he'd just given me a direct line to the one person who could take everything from him. And now, with Dalton's full authority, I was about to start pulling every thread I'd ever noticed in that company's tapestry. Threads Greg didn't even know were loose. The first step across the threshold felt less like a step and more like a lock clicking open. The next morning, I walked into Dalton Global's headquarters not as a vendor rep, but as their newest director of strategic accounts. My new badge felt heavier than it should have, probably because I knew exactly how much damage it could cause in the right hands. Dalton's legal team had already cleared a war room for me. A long glass table piled with contract binders, performance reports, compliance audits, and more printouts than I'd seen in years. At the far end sat Lisa Cho, Dalton's general counsel. I'd worked with her before, sharp, exacting, allergic to wasted time. Beside her was Marcus Velez, head of finance, the kind of man who could find a decimal out of place in a 300-page ledger without a calculator. Lisa didn't bother with small talk. "We'll start with the master services agreement." She slid a thick binder toward me. "I want to know if your former employer has been holding up their end. Every deliverable, every SLA, every clause." I opened the binder, scanning pages I already knew almost by heart. I'd lived these terms for years, but now I wasn't defending them, I was dissecting them. It didn't take long for the first crack to show. Delivery deadlines missed by days, sometimes weeks, quietly adjusted in quarterly reports. I highlighted each one, marking the corresponding penalty clause they'd never enforced. Marcus leaned over the table. "These missed deadlines, how did they explain them?" "Logistical bottlenecks," I said, flipping to a section I knew would make his jaw clench. But this, I tapped the page, is the kicker. They billed Dalton at the full contracted rate even when short-staffed, which is a direct breach of Section 4.3. He made a low sound in his throat, the kind you hear from someone adding up just how much money that's cost them. By midday, the list was growing ugly, overbilling disguised as rush processing fees that weren't authorized. Missed performance metrics on 2 consecutive quarters without penalty adjustments. Subcontractor swap that was never disclosed, a clear violation of the transparency clause. Each infraction on its own might have been brushed off, but together, they formed a pattern so obvious it could have been framed and hung on a wall. Greg had either been too arrogant to notice or too incompetent to care. Lisa sat back, crossing her arms. "If this is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it, we've got grounds for termination without liability. Possibly damages." "That's the goal," I said, keeping my tone neutral even as something in my chest tightened with grim satisfaction. Not everything was smooth, though. 2 members of Dalton's procurement team, both of whom had worked closely with Greg's people, were clearly uneasy. They weren't defending him outright, but their hesitation to hand over certain emails made me wonder if they were worried about what I'd find. Allies and enemies don't always wear name tags. Sometimes you have to watch their hands, not their faces. Late that afternoon, Lisa handed me a slim folder. "Final step is confirming the breach clauses. We We need the termination airtight, no wiggle room for negotiation once this lands. I took the folder, my fingers brushing the cool edge of the metal clip. Inside were the legal equivalents of surgical instruments, precise, final, and if used correctly, irreversible. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and my laptop, cross-referencing every clause against the violations we'd cataloged. Each checkmark was another nail in the coffin Greg had been building for himself without knowing it. By midnight, the list was complete. No speculation, no gray areas, just hard facts, dates, and signatures that told a story Greg would never be able to talk his way out of. The hurt from 2 days ago was still there, but it had been reshaped, honed down to a sharp point. Greg had humiliated me in front of the people I respected most. Now, I was going to end the one thing he valued more than his ego, his biggest account. And when I was finished, it would be clean, surgical. The kind of loss that doesn't just sting, it echoes. By the end of the week, the war room table looked like the aftermath of a legal hurricane. Neatly stacked evidence binders sat in rows, each labeled in bold marker: missed deliveries, overbilling, subcontractor breaches, noncompliance. Lisa's legal team had triple-checked every fact, cross-referenced every date, and attached supporting documents for each violation. The pile wasn't just a termination packet, it was an autopsy report on a once lucrative relationship, complete with cause of death. Lisa closed the final binder with a crisp snap. It's airtight. No arbitration, no cure period. They're in breach beyond repair. We can terminate immediately with zero liability. Marcus leaned back, arms crossed, and given the account size, losing this will hit their quarterly revenue like a brick through glass. Lisa turned to me, expression unreadable but eyes sharp. Question is, do you want to deliver it? There was no hesitation. Yes, it wasn't about gloating. This wasn't revenge porn in a boardroom. It was about control, about making sure the last word in this mess came from me, not Greg. He'd staged my exit for maximum humiliation. I'd return the favor with maximum precision. Lisa slid the termination letter across the table. It was just a few paragraphs on Dalton letterhead, but every line was loaded. Dates, clauses, direct citations of the breaches, each one a bullet point Greg couldn't dodge. At the bottom was Mr. Dalton's signature, bold, deliberate, final. "We'll go in with Marcus," Lisa said. "He'll handle any financial disputes on the spot. But make no mistake, once you hand this over, it's done. They can't talk their way back into the account." Understood. That night, I barely slept. Not from doubt, there was no question this was justified, but from the adrenaline of knowing exactly how this would play out. I kept picturing Greg's face when he realized what I was holding, when the reality sank in that his star account was gone. Not in months or weeks, but now. I laid out my outfit with the same care I used for high-stakes negotiations. Neutral colors, clean lines, no jewelry that could clink against the table. I wanted nothing to distract from the letter. I even printed a second copy for myself, purely to savor the feel of it in my hands. The morning of, Marcus met me in the lobby of Dalton Global. "Ready?" he asked, voice low. I gave a small smile, more than ready. He rode in silence to my old office. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, but it wasn't nerves, it was anticipation, sharp and focused. For days, I'd been gathering ammunition. Now, I was walking straight into enemy territory to pull the trigger. When we stepped into the building, the receptionist froze for half a beat before recovering with a polite smile. My badge was gone, but the Dalton visitor pass clipped to my blazer sent its own kind of message. Marcus handled the small talk while I stood there, letter in hand, feeling the weight of every step I'd taken since Greg's little performance in Dalton's boardroom. This was the inmost cave, the point of no return, and I wasn't here to knock. I was here to walk through the front door, sit across from Greg, and end the one thing keeping his career upright. Perfectly. Cleanly. On my terms. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I could feel the shift in the air. Familiar hallways. Same stale coffee smell, but now, every glance in my direction lingered half a second too long. People noticed the badge clipped to my blazer, the Dalton logo in silver against navy. I could almost hear the mental gears turning. Greg's assistant, Chloe, looked up from her desk, eyes darting to Marcus at my side, then back to me. Sarah, he's in his office." Without waiting for an invitation, I walked past her. Marcus followed, carrying a slim leather portfolio like it contained nothing more dangerous than meeting notes. Greg was leaning back in his chair when I stepped in, scrolling on his phone. When he looked up, his face went through 3 quick stages: confusion, recognition, and finally, that oily smugness I'd seen so many times. He set the phone down and gestured to the chair across from him like he was granting me an audience. "Well," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk, "I didn't think you'd be back so soon. Couldn't stay away?" I didn't answer. Just sat down, smoothed the letter on the desk in front of me, and slid it toward him. He glanced at the Dalton letterhead, then back at me, smirk widening. "What's this, a pitch for us to win you back? I hope it's better than the Q3 forecast you." "Read it," I said, calm and flat. Greg's eyes narrowed, but he picked up the document. The silence stretched as he scanned the first paragraph, his posture still relaxed. Then he hit the second, where the breach clauses were cited in black and white. His smirk flickered barely, but I saw it. By the third paragraph, his hand had stopped moving the page. Marcus shifted his weight beside me, silent, a witness to every beat of this moment. This is a joke, Greg said finally, trying to inject a laugh into the words, but failing. Dalton can't just, they can, I said evenly, and they have, effective immediately. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC. Greg's gaze darted back to the letter, as if a reread might conjure a loophole that wasn't there. I kept my expression neutral. No smirk, no raised eyebrow, nothing that could be twisted into gloating. He didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me revel in it. When he finally looked up, the cockiness was gone, replaced by something tight around his mouth. You think this hurts me? I tilted my head slightly. I think it changes things. Marcus placed a second folder on Greg's desk, financial reconciliation figures. This is what you'll need to process today, he said, voice clipped. We'll handle the offboarding of any shared systems access immediately. Greg stared at him, then back at me, but I was already rising from my chair. Goodbye, Greg. My tone was polite, almost pleasant, like I was ending a meeting that had run its course, and in a way I was. Greg's fingers twitched slightly as he turned the next page, the faint rasp of paper against paper sounding louder than it should in the silence. That easy arrogance he wore like cologne was evaporating fast. His eyes darted from clause to clause, landing on the sections that left no room for argument: missed delivery metrics, unauthorized subcontracting, overbilling with documented proof. Each paragraph was a lock clicking shut. When he reached the final breach of contract citation, his voice slipped. This is exaggerated. You've been waiting to before he could finish. The door swung open and the CFO, David Harkins, stepped in. I hadn't seen him in years, but the look on his face told me this wasn't a social drop-in. His skin had the pallor of someone who'd just gotten news you can't walk back. Greg. Harkin's voice was clipped, his eyes locked on the letter in Greg's hands. Is that what I think it is? Greg didn't answer. He just shifted the pages slightly so the Dalton letterhead was visible. Harkins came closer, scanning the text. His jaw tightened. Do you have any idea what losing this account does to our Q4? It's half our projected revenue. Half. Greg started to stammer something about negotiating terms, but Harkins cut him off sharply. There is no negotiation. This is final. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just watched the realization hit in waves. First the numbers, losses so big they'd ripple through every department. Then the politics, the board meetings, the shareholder calls, the late-night damage control that would be Greg's new normal. Harkins glanced at me for the first time. He didn't smile, but there was an understanding there. He knew exactly why I was in the room and exactly how deliberate this was. Greg, on the other hand, looked smaller somehow, still trying to salvage scraps of control, but every second the paper sat in his hands was another second of authority bleeding out of him. Effective immediately, I reminded quietly, my tone even. The satisfaction was there, but I kept it buried under a calm exterior. This wasn't the time for victory laps. This was about precision. Greg had chosen to humiliate me in front of the one client he couldn't afford to lose. Now, that client had sent me back to dismantle him from the inside, and I was doing exactly that, one page at a time. I rose from the chair, taking my time, letting the scrape of it against the floor punctuate the silence in Greg's office. The letter was still in his hands, but now it hung limply, like it weighed more than he could hold. I smoothed the front of my jacket, squared my shoulders, and met his eyes just long enough to speak. This is effective immediately. Greg's mouth opened, some half-formed protest already rushing to the surface. But before he could get a single syllable out, Harkins cut in, voice low and sharp. Stop talking, Greg. You've already done enough damage. The words landed harder than anything I could have said. Greg's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between us like he was searching for a foothold that wasn't there. He found nothing. I didn't wait for whatever came next. I turned, opened the door, and walked out without another glance. My heels struck the hallway tile in a steady rhythm, each step carrying me further from the wreckage I'd just left behind. The air outside his office felt different, lighter, untainted. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed. One new message. Mr. Dalton, perfectly executed. I let the corner of my mouth lift, just barely. No one else needed to see it. No one else needed to know that the humiliation Greg had tried to brand into me had been quietly and completely erased. Outside, the sun was bright, the air sharp with the kind of chill that wakes you up. I didn't rush to my car. I didn't check to see if anyone was watching me leave. Because this ending, didn't need an audience. It didn't need applause or a victory speech. The only thing that mattered was that Greg was done, and I'd been the one to close the book on him. Clean, final, and entirely on my terms. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.